period, and in modern theology also. Kant's three critiques are related to those three. The critique of pure reason to truth, what we can know, and critique of practical reason to the question of the good, in the sense of the moral good. What must we do? And the critique of judgment, the third one, to the beautiful. And he saw the critique of judgment in some mysterious way as a bridge. It's a very obscure document. A bridging the other two, which I might get to explain. But in any case, he wrote those three critiques corresponding to those three, in his mind, very distinct concepts that are important to human beings: the true, the good, and the beautiful. That distinction, as he held it, being symptomatic of the modern splitting of the three from each other, and you can do one, you can do the other, you can do the other, and so on. But interesting that he's dealing with those three. But in any case, in the prolegomena to any future metaphysics, he talks always as if he thinks that there is such a thing as metaphysics, and he does. It's just that when you understand what he means by metaphysics, you would say, why do it? But be that as it may, he begins, certainly not the first sentence, but the whole beginning of his thing. He wants to raise this question. He wants to frame this thing in terms of this one question, which is, how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? Right? How are synthetic a priori judgments possible? Now, what in the world? It probably never occurred to any of us as a question. Probably because we don't know what he means by synthetic a priori judgments. And if we did, it might occur as a question. So it's a strange question to begin with, but it is, in one sense, a very good introduction to his philosophy, because it puts us in relation to Hume, and in a way. Hume famously, Kant famously said, he read a lot, since he was there taking his walk and being in Königsberg all the time. He didn't have anything else to do except, these guys didn't have to work. You see, most philosophers did not have to work with their hands in any way. They were independently wealthy. Not all of them. Spinoza was a lens grinder. I mean, there are exceptions to this, but I'm saying, throughout the tradition, these guys were of the wealthy class, usually. As this user. But Kant read Hume, and it was the big instigation for him to really develop a philosophy of his own, because he'd started out, as you might have read in a little introduction, a rationalist. He kind of liked Spinoza, and if you got the taste of Spinoza, we didn't do a lot in Spinoza last week, but if you got the taste, I wanted to show you how it starts off with this supposedly clear and distinct idea of God, and then kind of deduces everything from that. Spinoza's system, his own way of doing it, everything is part of the one substance of God, because by substance we mean something that, you define all these things. Substance is something that doesn't depend on anything else for its being. Well, if that's the way you define substance, well, then that has to be God, you see, and so there's only one substance, and Everything else is some kind of mode of, or attribute of the one substance. You develop this pantheistic system. But these rationalist systems were they were innerly coherent in the sense that they developed this deductive kind of system. But so what? I mean, where did they touch reality? But Kant began in that tradition that was big in Germany at the time, since they were not going to be empiricists, you see. They believed there was something more than just the senses and association by the senses and so on as the empiricists, the English empiricists. But their idea of metaphysics was this clear idea thing, you see, in which you had sort of like a geometrical system which had these clear concepts, and you worked them out in that way. But the rationalists wanted some kind of metaphysics or something more than just. They wanted to talk about God. They wanted to talk about the big things. But in my view, they lost the key to that. With that whole idea that the ideas all had to be like mathematical ideas. Anyway, Kant started out in that tradition. He loved philosophy, but he read. I guess he decided one day, I better read Hume. Keep talking about him as sort of the enemy, you know. I better read him, and he read him. He was fascinated by Hume, which I can understand. And he said, Hume, he uses this phrase elsewhere too, awoke him from his dogmatic slumbers, you see. Wait a minute, Hume's challenging, what do you mean by that, and how does it relate to experience, and all this sort of thing in Hume, you know. Kant found that challenging and interesting. And he decided he had to answer Hume and develop a philosophy that was responsive to the challenges that Hume brought, those skeptical, empiricist kinds of challenges that Hume brought forward. And everything sort of rose out of that. And this question, how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? If we can get to understand that one question, we'll have done something. See? That is the key to it. It's a way into the whole of Kant's philosophy. So we have to understand what he means by synthetic a priori judgments. Judgments are just like propositions. Propositions, judgments, called it. Just, A is B, whatever. The cat is furry, the grass is green, whatever. Just statements in a categorical way, as we say, about the world, about anything else. Mathematics, 2 + 2 = 4, and so on. Propositions that just try to express some truth about things. This is that. Predicates, predications. A is B. Whatever. Now, this division of propositions or judgments into analytic and synthetic on the one hand, and a priori and a posteriori on the other, is, I believe, new with Kant. The terms had all been used before, but the way he sets it up here is something new. Now, so take analytic and synthetic. What's an analytic proposition? An analytic proposition is one that's true by the definition of the terms. See? So, if I say all bachelors are unmarried, You say, well, yeah. Why? Because what I mean by bachelor is less.
A bachelor is? What?
All right, let me try this again. If I say all bachelors are unmarried.
Is this true?
Is it definition?
Yeah, it's true, because bachelor is defined as what?
Unmarried man.
Unmarried man. Thank you. Yeah, right. So it's got to be true. It's true analytically by virtue of the definition. That's an analytic judgment, an analytic proposition. A synthetic proposition, by contrast, is one that does not unfold simply as a result of its definition. So if I say all bachelors are good cooks, that may or may not be true. But it's a synthetic proposition. We have to go and look, check it out, right? It's not part of the definition. Whether it's true or false has nothing to do with it. You say it's a synthetic proposition, and for us to figure out whether it's true or false, we have to look at the empirical evidence. That's the only way. All right. So there's analytic and synthetic propositions or judgments, call them what you will. That's a straightforward enough distinction. And you'd think that analytic propositions are sort of almost silly, and of course that remains to be seen. There's been big arguments about that, but at least we can see the distinction. A priori and a posteriori are closely related, but a little different. A priori means I know this prior to experience. A priori. A posteriori, I know it only after experience. So, an a priori proposition might be, certainly it seems that analytic propositions or judgments are a priori in the sense that you don't have to go out and do anything to determine their truth. You just have to think, well, wait, that's... But there could be others too, you see. Say someone says, well, I know here's an example from St. Thomas, for example. He doesn't use this terminology. This is Kant's terminology. If I say the whole is greater than the part, you could say that's true by definition, but when I say that, I mean something more. I mean, I've sort of realized in life that there's this prior idea I bring to it of whole and part, you see, that makes sense out of everything else. I kind of lay it on the world, and it opens things up. Where I got it, I don't know, and people could argue, but it seems that if I say the whole is greater than the part, I don't need to go out and experiment to find that. I just say, wait, that's a principle which will just be true wherever I look. I can use it in other things. This is the whole and this is the part. Oh, okay. It's just that very distinction. So it has the idea of bringing it to experience rather than getting it from experience. If there are any such, we can be very, you see, You might say that the analytic propositions are all that way. There are a dime a dozen. I could define anything and make it up and then say, oh, that's just for wise by definition. So, yeah. But a priori principles, you see, would be these ideas that are so basic that we don't have to prove them, and yet they really help us understand everything else. If there are any such. A posteriori would be, I know them only after experience. I have to, like synthetic propositions, but the emphasis here is on how I know them. I know them only in my experiencing of the world and checking it out and so on. After experience, through and after experience, not before it, prior to it. So there's a little difference between those two, analytic, synthetic, and a priori, a posteriori. Enough difference to help us formulate the following thing. It seems right away to many people, it would seem that, well, analytic and a priori are so close together that there are analytic a priori statements. All the analytic ones are a priori, all the a priori ones are in a sense analytic or something, or so it seems. And someone might say, well, the synthetic and a posteriori go so close together, I only know the synthetic through checking it out, you know, and it's the same as a posteriori. But Kant wants to say there are some propositions which are a priori but synthetic. That is, the predicate adds some new meaning to the subject. It's not included in the subject analytically, like bachelors who are unmarried say. It adds something, and at the same time, it's known absolutely without checking it out through experience. That's what he wants to say. In other words, this whole thing is, there's this category of synthetic a priori judgments, and they're the interesting ones. Well, what would be an example of a synthetic, of what seems to be a synthetic a priori judgment? He argued even that, you see, whereas some people would say, and a lot of modern analytic philosophers have said, mathematics statements are all analytic. They say that, you know, they say they're just true by definition. But Kant disagreed. He said, if I say 7 plus 5 equals 12, I may not know the answer. You know? Now, how do I find the answer? It's true, I have to count up what 7 involves and what 5 involves, but I don't. From the simple understanding of what 7 is and what 5 is, I don't automatically see that it adds up to 12. He said, if this were not the case, all the easy mistakes in addition would not happen. I mean, there's some way in which, when I grasp that 7 plus 5 is the same as the number 12, that adds something. The 12 adds something to my concept of 7 and my concept of 5. It's not analytically true. And yet, it's a priori. It's not, I don't have to go out and lay down 7 carrots and 5 carrots and count them. I can come to see this in another way. I don't have to do that, see. But it's still, but it's synthetic, that the 12 adds something to the 7 and 5 that I don't see at first, and it's not involved in the concept. And so it's a synthetic, but a priori principle. A priori in the sense that the way I get hold of it is not by going out and, as I say, counting carrots and things. I think it through. Brother Nathan, this is not unrelated to some of the things we were talking about today, and it's complicated because you see that. But anyway, like in metaphysics, anyway. But Jeff, you see that we were talking about. Whether is it analytic or synthetic that being is good? You see, that doesn't necessarily fit into these categories. But so this is part of the problem here. You see, all right. But anyway, Kant's looking at these simple things. Everybody agrees mathematics works. It's true. What are these propositions? And he says, in mathematics, the magic of it is the reason why you keep making discoveries in it. Unlike, if you go around saying all bachelors are unmarried, you're going to be pretty boring. No one's, it's, But if you say, you come up with a new mathematical thing, and they say, I never thought of that. Is that true? And you show the proof and so on. They had the concept of the premises, but they didn't see that conclusion. So the conclusion adds something, it seems, to the premises. So he argued that very strongly. But those were not the cases that were most important to him. And in modern philosophy, as I say, contemporary philosophy, 20th century philosophy, a lot of philosophers, I think wrongly, because I think this is a simplistic distinction that he's got set up here, but I think wrongly reverted to the idea that all mathematical statements are analytic. They were defenders of Hume, and they had to take that position. Not that Hume said that, but relations of ideas for Hume, you see, would be analytic. Anyway. Be that as it may, the kind of synthetic a priori or seemingly synthetic a priori judgment that interested Kant was, let's just take the simple example because this gets us into the heart of the problem. He looks at Hume's thing about causality, see? And if you take, suppose someone says, here, just off the top, suppose someone says, every effect has a cause. Is that synthetic or analytic? It's analytic. Why? Because effect means what? Something that's caused, right?
Yeah.
So of course every effect has a cause. By definition, right? That's clear. It's analytic. But suppose somebody says every event has a cause. Whether it's true or false, it's not synthetic. You see, I'm sorry, it's not analytic. It's not analytic, it's synthetic. Because the notion of event, unlike the notion of effect, you see, it's a good example, does not contain anything about having a cause. It's just something that happens, right? An event is something that takes place. And if someone says every event has a cause, they're saying that every event is cause. Every event is an effect, would be another way to say it. That's a synthetic proposition. Now, Hume denies that. Denies that we can say that or know that. For Hume, an event is an event. If you find some cause for it, all that means is you found something, all right, that's always there whenever it happens, A before B. And so you say, all right, it has a cause. But you have no right whatsoever to say every event has a cause. Who says? That's a matter surely of... And you don't even know what you mean by cause, you see, other than every event has something that precedes it that can be related to it by, such that whenever one happens, the other happens. How would you say? So for Hume, there are no synthetic a priori judgments. I think one of the reasons why Kant raises the mathematics thing is because Hume and the empiricists consistently avoid mathematics, they're talking about those propositions. And so, Kant likes to say, wait a minute, look, all right. But the place where he really wants to go, or at least most of us today take him as having gone most importantly, is to say, look, in a way, Hume was right because he said, this is just, if you want to put it in these terms, Hume pointed out that such a judgment as every effect has a cause is synthetic. That's true. The notion of cause does not contain the notion of effect. An event does not contain the notion of cause. But we know it. It's true that everything that happens must have a cause. How do we know it? That's the question. Why do we say we know it? I suppose you could ask Kant that. Why aren't we human? Because he'd say, come on, everybody knows it. If something happens, no matter what it is, if someone says it just happened, you say, no, it didn't just happen. It had some cause. How do you know that? You can't say, oh, I've had enough experience to know that every effect has a cause. No, you haven't. I mean, you observe things happening all the time. You don't know what causes what half the time. But you are interested in a few things that you can set up and say this will cause that. But no, you haven't. But if something happens and somebody says we don't know, it just happened. You say no. I mean, what made it happen? See? Even if someone says God made it happen, okay, good. I mean, the point is something made it happen. And Kant says, let's not give in to Hume here. We know that. What's troubling Hume is how in the world we can ever know that, since we don't know it by experience. We bring that principle to experience. We look at our experience, and whatever happens, we immediately, without any kind of, we don't have to be schooled in this. Look for what made it happen, whatever it is. So Kant is so convinced that we're all convinced deep down, you see, that everything has a cause, that he chooses the option of saying, no, we can't just wipe that away and say we're all deluded here in some superficial way. We know that and claim to know it in a different way than we claim to know that all bachelors are good cooks, or even something that we actually would claim to know, like the moon goes around the earth. We're pretty sure of that, but we know that only as a result of various kinds of hypotheses and experiments that interlink and so on. And, but we would have to admit, if we really thought about it, that it's a matter of probability, that we establish it through a high level of experimentation and links up with other things that we think, and so on. You see, but we wouldn't say it's a synthetic proposition. But every event has a cause. That's at the basis of our whole science. In other words, we go looking for what makes the Earth go, Earth go around the sun, or whatever I said or didn't say. We go looking for that because we believe that every event has a cause, and we know it. And we know we can find something eventually, and maybe we'll be wrong. We'll find something else, that can account for why something happens. And so Kant's thing is, what then, to clarify that question, how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? That's the big one that concerns him most and the one that concerns us most. Because it's not like mathematics, which is about concepts and so on. It's about the world. The real world, and it seems to hold, and it seems to be the basis of our exploration of the world and so on. And it seems to be pretty. Now the answer to that is going to be that we have a structure. We approach our experience with a structure that rigorously interprets our experience. We see everything through that structure. We can't see anything outside it, around it, right? And we will inevitably impose that upon our experience. We don't get it from experience, we impose it upon experience. Another ultimately perhaps simplistic disjunction. I mean, what does it mean to get something from experience? Certainly we don't get it from experience inductively by tabulating probabilities. Is there another way we get it from experience? Perhaps. But if these are the only two, we either get it from experience in that empiricist way, or we impose it on experience. And Kant chooses the latter. We impose it on experience. That is, we can't have experience that doesn't fit into it somehow. Our way of seeing things just holds everything, interprets everything within a framework that we can't get out of. So, in one sense, we know every event has a cause, because within our framework it'll never be otherwise. We'll always find something, we'll always find some way of relating things causally that'll make some kind of sense to us. But cause and effect are, like Hume said, not analytically related, so that, and that'll always be a question: is this the cause or something else? We have to investigate that, but that there's something, it'll always be part of the thing, and we'll always find something, because it'll work, it will make it work. So that means, is this true of reality in itself? No, says Kant. We don't know. See, we don't know what reality in itself is like. We see it all through a set of glasses that we can't take off. See? We don't see reality as God sees it. Lord knows what that is. We see it in a human way, but to see it in a human way is to see it through a certain interpretive way. Our intellect has a way of grasping it. It's through logic, and then it imposes that logic on the empirical thing and puts it together with those concepts of necessity and all this sort of thing. Remember, Hume said he thinks we borrowed from the mathematical realm the concept of necessity and try to put it in in the empirical world as if this is something we could learn to stop doing, you know. But no, it's much deeper than that. The two are united in the way we look at the reality. The critique of pure reason is all about showing how the structure of logic is part of the way we ultimately receive empirical reality, and there are primary concepts of the sensory world that are dictated by that logical frame permeating into the matter of things, and causation is one. It is the world of necessity that's in mathematics, but it's the world of necessity now in things that has a different form. It's the notion of cause. And so Kant is convinced on the one hand that there are certain propositions like everything has a cause, every event has a cause that we can be absolutely certain about, but certain meaning, we're not doing metaphysics here, we're just saying as we approach the world, that's the way we're going to see it, let's get on with it. If someone says, what's beyond all that? Is this the way, the ultimate way the world is? Who can say that that's something beyond that doesn't concern us? And so, in a way, Kant winds up being a stronger skeptic than Hume. I mean, because he's making this big point about the difference between reality in itself and reality as we inevitably see it and interpret it in our framework. And, you know, but in that sense, he thinks he's answered Hume, because it's just silly for Hume to go around saying, well, there's nothing more to our concept of cause than one thing following another. Yes, there is. There is a sense of necessity of some sort there, and it is related to our necessity in mathematics, and it's a big part of the structure that we lay on reality. And so the critique of pure reason, which is the real problem, you know, is all about that jiving between the intellectual and the empirical, in forming a single way of seeing things that we're stuck within. That's fine. That's very fruitful. We get to explore the world and do all the stuff that we do. But that's what the all the shooting's about in terms of synthetic a priori propositions, because obviously they are. Hume's battling against, you know, quixotically against what everybody knows. There's a difference in our concept of cause from the idea of one thing following another regularly. Yeah, there is. And so there you have it. For one thing, I mean that's. But you say, well, all right, how does he? Why does he draw such a strict line between the way we see the world and the way it is in itself? Why not say it's sort of analogous or something, and we see it partly but not fully? Or why does he draw such a strict, clear line? The way we see it and the way it is in itself, and which we can represent as saying reality in itself, X. We see it from behind this screen, you see. And everything we see, we interpret through this whole structure that we're involved in here, and that's what's going on. But well, But as I say, that leads him to an extreme skepticism. It leads him to say that insofar as there's something called metaphysics, it's not going to tell us about this world out here. It's just the ultimate organization of our concepts at their extreme. So of the concepts of this system at their extreme. So we can't help believe in a way that there's for instance, an ultimate integration of the world. Like that when we look at the world and all the things happening, we don't see the world, we see things happening. But we can't help believe that the world is an integrated whole of some sort. I mean, everything that's happening is somehow connected, and that it's connected at a source that integrates it all and holds it together. Call that God, the world, and the self. We're involved in this as part of it and see it and so on. These concepts of a self, the I, the world, God, are inescapable for us. We're always going to have them. And we can organize them quite efficiently, he wants to show you, see, and say, so they're the ultimate boundaries of our conceptual scheme that we can't escape. We all have. See, but Kant's very interested in seeing what all human beings would have to have, you see, so that we don't need revealed religion or anything like that. We can just say, of course, it's natural for human beings to worship a creator in that sort of distant deistic way of the 18th century. You know, there's something, right? But even there, if you can't get too crazy about it, because it's only the way we know it's the way we have to think. Whether that really corresponds to reality, we don't know. But it's natural to think that way. Just as it's natural to think that everything has a cause, it's natural to think that the world is one and has some integrating author and so on. But all those concepts are still on this side of the screen. They're within our framework. And we can organize those. Organizing those would be to do metaphysics. Just as organizing the next level down would be to do mathematics, and the next level down is to do the sciences. But these are all on our side of the screen. They don't touch reality as it is in itself. Now why? So you can see how he can say, sure, there's metaphysics. It's not that I don't see why anyone would want to do metaphysics after they've understood Kant, if they accept what he says, because it's not telling us about what we want to know. Anyway, it's telling us about how we think. That's all. See, everything is only telling us about how we think. The interesting part is the sciences, because we have all kinds of information coming in which we get a chance to organize. See, everything is about the sciences. That's where we get to find new things and develop new theories and Kant himself contributed to modern science in astronomy and stuff like this. And I forget what. There are people who know more about this than I do, and then I read it and it goes, I forget, because it doesn't. But whatever. But he made some contributions, serious contributions, to the development of 18th century physics. And all this stuff. We can do the sciences. I mean, but we just don't believe that they're telling us anything metaphysical, anything ultimate, anything about that. We need to do metaphysics if somebody wants to do that. It's just that it's kind of a idle, thing. It's like logic. It's kind of organizing the way we think. But the way we think, in other words, someone says, the way we think, that's logic. You see, well, this is much bigger than logic as normal. Says, no, the way we think is inevitably in terms of a one world, a self, and a creator. But all we're doing is mapping the way that's natural for the human beings to think. So someone could say, well, what's that? What's in that? I just want to do the stuff, the sciences thing. And you said, that's right. That's right. That's what we can do. You see. So, you see, now, just to jump ahead for just be a little ahead of the game there. when it comes to that religious question, seeing all that, Kant would say, well, all right, but is there any further reason for thinking that those concepts, like the concept of God, has any real traction in things, you see? And in one sense, he'd say, it's a complete leap of faith. It's certainly open to you. There's nothing to stop you from it. But there's one thing more, and that he develops in that whole moral critique and things, because you see, he says, it looks like we have this practical reason that very different from the speculative reason that tries to understand what reality is like out there. We look inward, and we find a sense of obligation, that certain things are just wrong. Now, various cultures have different ideas of what they think are right and wrong, but they all have an idea that there is something that's wrong as opposed to right. And why is that? Because there's a fundamental law at the base of the way human beings in community see the thing that is not, in a sense, rational. It comes from reason, from practical reason, but so give me the example. It's what he calls the moral imperative, the categorical imperative. You see, if the basic idea that whatever I think is wrong, I shouldn't do if I don't want you to do it. You see, that I don't make an exception of myself to whatever I think. Now, we can argue about what the laws should be, but the underlying principle of all the laws is that if I see it as a law, I include you and myself under it equally. You see. Where do we get that? I mean, because, a part of us would say, if you keep all the laws and I don't, and I can get away without keeping them, I win, I mean, this is why not? See, what tells us that that's wrong? You see, that fundamental principle is wrong, regardless of what we think the particular law should be. See, because there was a philosophy in the 19th century, called utilitarianism, which just said basically we have to decide together what works, and the good is what will make the greatest number happy, and so on. But utilitarianism always got hung up at this very point. Why should we all do that? If we can get everybody doing what's advantageous for the group, why should I do it if I can get away with it? Because then the fundamental question that Kant was dealing with, he's not dealt with. How do I know? And why is it? And why does something tell me that's wrong to make an exception of myself, where I think there's a rule of some sort that the community should follow for the greater good? So we don't get away from the categorical imperative. What he means by categorical imperative there is, it's not a hypothetical. See, most imperatives are hypothetical. The doctor says, take these pills. But what that really means is, if you want to get well, take these pills, right? Oh, okay. That's implicit. We're assuming you came to the doctor because you want to get well or you want to avoid some illness. So take these pills means, of course, if you're concerned about getting well, this is what you should do. If then, hypothetical. That's a hypothetical imperative. Mm-hmm. Most of our imperatives are hypothetical. See? Somebody says, wear a coat in the winter. Well, why? I mean, because if it's not like it's like if you don't want to die of pneumonia or something, wear a coat. You know what I mean? There's an if there. If then. See? We don't often have to say it because it's assumed in the thing. So, just like in here, he asks, how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? When he writes about moral issues, he said, is there a categorical imperative? In other words, a do this that doesn't have an if-then to it. We just know it. And he finds it in this idea that do not make an exception of yourself, you see, to the rule. If you believe everybody should do it, you've got to do it yourself. How do I know that? It's not necessary. Can I prove that it's advantageous to me? No. I just know it, you see. And so he says that's implanted in us. It's not a matter of speculative reason. It's a matter of an interior understanding. It's just that it's a priori. You see, it's at the basis of our moral understanding as human beings, and we can squelch it. We can, but it's the fundamental voice of conscience, and so. All these things you could argue with him and take the various angles of it, but you see where he's going. And so, for him, if someone says, "Why should I live that life?" and the shorter answer, there is no why. It's not advantageous to you. You just should. You know that. But on the other hand, in the long run, we do look coherently for some relation between doing the right thing and some reward or happiness, some advantage. We don't do it because it's advantageous to us, he says, but we do rightfully expect some harmony between those two things, that the person who does the right thing will in the long run somehow be rewarded. We can't prove that, but it's natural to us, part of our reasonable structure, to believe that. And that supports belief in God, you see. It doesn't prove it, but it supports it, because it means that with that we say, we take the leap, but the leap's not really blind. It says, this possible disharmony between right action and reward is compensated for ultimately somewhere, in a heaven, in an afterlife, in God in some way, who makes all things right. That there's a place where these things converge. And so, but you can't prove it, but that adds impact to someone who takes the leap of faith and puts trust in a quite invisible and unprovable God, because it means that he or she is really doing the most ultimately reasonable thing, in a way, although it can't be proved, because it pulls together both, in a way, the speculative and the practical reason, you see, because the speculative says, well, we have to hold that there's some author, but we can't really show that that's reality in itself, but it's natural to us to think that way. And then the moral law says we've got to do the thing that's disadvantageous even to ourselves if it's the right thing, and we know that, but at the same time, how does that make sense in terms of the fragmentation of the person? And it sort of all comes together. The religious hypothesis holds it all together. And so it's the most rational way to be, is to hold a vaguely religious sense about things, and in some sense trust God. Anyway, that's where he goes with that. But metaphysically, we can't see beyond that big screen. And now my question is, why does he hold for such a sharp distinction between the way we see things and the way they are in themselves? Since it's obviously possible to talk about a little leakage here, that we see things imperfectly, but we have a dim grasp. I mean, that's after all what classical metaphysics is always saying. We don't know that much in a way, but we do know just enough to see that there must be a God, and things like this, that even though those concepts elude us, get beyond us at a certain point, we see into the mystery partly. The partial truth is not a falsehood. But why does Kant draw it so sharply? Why would you say? Do you have anybody have any ideas as to why, if I put the question that way, why does he draw this so? Reality itself and the way we see it, and there's no passage between the two. It's just, yeah.
Is it because almost he feels like we haven't discovered the whole like, because we're always having maybe these a priori, we haven't figured everything out yet. So like you realize in math, like you kind of come up with these new.
Joe's coming up with more stuff, yeah.
So he feels like behind there's this curtain, and behind it there's all the fullness of.
But all those things are still all on this side of the curtain.
Oh. I don't know.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Because in the sciences, all the scientific things are all on this side of the curtain. It's the way we see it. I mean, and the same with math. Yeah, so it's only, I mean, I've mentioned this to you before, but I'll mention it again. I've known people who seem to live this pretty comfortably. I mean, scientists that I knew when I was in graduate school who were brilliant scientists, and they'd say, well, or this one, I mean, people have different positions. There's one guy I knew pretty well, which is secular. Philosophy? No, when I was an undergraduate at Columbia, I studied some philosophy. In my freshman year, I studied Kant, and he said, I think Kant is right, that's it. So in my science, I don't think that we're grasping reality in itself, whatever that is. It's not what we're doing. We're just putting our world of experience together in such a way that makes a coherent, exciting, coherent whole out of it. But I don't think that we're penetrating being, or something, you see, in any important sense. It's just, we're just exploring our horizons, and those are limited. He just accepted Kant. He said that's obviously the answer then. So that, I mean, and he was quite content to be making discoveries in that area, all the time, and but completely untroubled by the idea that it wasn't ultimately about about reality in itself. It was just about the way we see things, about some limited world of our experience that we organize. And that's not uncommon. I think, not that all scientists think that, and I don't mean you have to be religious to not think that, but I mean, some are straightforward materialists and think reality is material and that's all, and studying the physical sciences is showing us more and more about that reality, and that's the only reality there is, and we're coming to see it, and we're part of it, and we understand that, and they're more optimistic philosophically. But you could be a good scientist and be on either side of that. You see, you could be, so the materialist is a straightforward atheist, but he believes that we're grasping what real reality, what it is. And the Kantian says just an agnostic, that says no, we're just understanding the way we're... But it doesn't make any difference to the science they do, right? I mean, and opinions on that sort of thing are seen as well. Everybody has their opinion. So, yeah. Now I want to suggest to you that the reason there's a reason, a demonstrable reason here of why he held this. You see, in the critique of pure reason, but also in here, in this shortened, this little prolegomena to anti-future metaphysics, which is, it's not the critique of pure reason. He tried to say, look, I'm going to kind of summarize what I'm saying, but Kant's not a summarizer, And you start reading it, it's like, he can't help himself. He's not... He needed an editor if he was going to really summarize. But you see, the big main book, the thing, is the famous thing. I think, I don't know if I told you this. It's so famous. There's people who know about, who've heard of the critique of pure reason, who've heard of very little else, surprisingly. Did I tell you, one summer, back when I was in college, I was working in the summer out in the Midwest, in the trees. Did I tell you this?
Last class.
Were they like lumberjacks or something? Or
Tree people, Davy tree experts. They were.
Davy tree.
Yeah.
That's big. That's everywhere. The Davy tree people. They have a lot of rivals these days, but they were in every state, that kind of thing. But the way they work, they have these little crews that go out every day. You see, and if you get a job with them, I had a summer job with these guys. You get assigned to this little crew. So there's a few guys on this crew. And they're up at 5 o'clock in the morning and out there, and having breakfast at one of these greasy spoons, and then you're out there for the day. And it's a rough day, and in summer, I can never believe why they kept me on this job. They would, in those days, those are the days before all the big elm trees died, those big 90-foot elms, they'd go up them and you climb up them without spikes, you tie yourself up in a rope up there and swing around. They did that some, but they let me do a lot of other things on the ground a lot of the time. There's a lot of stuff to be done, but anyway, they were a rough and very simple crew, These guys were from the dirt, they were just very basic guys from the Midwest, and no education or anything. But so one time, I got to know them pretty well. It was a fun summer in many ways. This one guy, I don't know, I needed a ride or something, and it didn't come, and we had to wait. And he said, "Why don't you come to my house, and here, I'll give you a beer." So I went to his house, and went in his house and so on. And I saw, among other things, this little bookshelf. And it had a couple of books in it. So naturally, I always look at books, See, and one of the books was Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. I said, what are you doing with this? Where'd you get this? He said, I heard that's a very important book. So when I saw a copy of it, I thought I'd pick it right up, because I know I got to read it someday. And I thought, God bless you. Because, he was going to read it. But he had a copy of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. He'd heard of that, you see. And I was a student, and I had this brilliant philosophy professor who turned me on to all this stuff. And you're always shocked as a student to think the philosophy professor is also struggling trying to understand certain things. That's always of course he is. But my first shock of that was I knocked on his door for something, and I went, and he's sitting there at his desk, and I said, what, the way you would. I said, gee, why What are you reading? Hey, what are you reading? I hate people that they ask, oh, what are you reading? In a restaurant or something. But the point is, he said, I am trying to make some sense out of Kant's critique of pure reason. I remember in a moment I thought, gee, that's impressive. At the same time, what? He hasn't got it mastered. He doesn't understand. No, of course not. So he's telling me he struggled to understand Kant's critique of pure reason. And this guy, working with the trees is saying, I got to read that someday. So it's everywhere. Anyway, what he does in there, he gets toward the end of the book, he develops these things that he calls the antinomies of pure reason. And they're in this thing too. They come in the section that I did not put in the assignment page. You make these assignments. I don't know what to tell you to read. The whole thing is impossible from start to finish. I mean, what are you supposed to, but I want you to get a taste of these things. Anyway, in a section that's not included in that, but I'm going to point it out to you now, it's just a little chart. And it's going to steer us here. Because I think... No, hold on. Okay, it's way up ahead on page...
Wow.
Page 809. All right, what he's doing here, just above it, he says this antinomy, you see, as all the metaphysical art of the most subtle distinction cannot prevent this opposition, it compels the philosopher to recur to the first sources of pure reason itself. This antinomy, not arbitrarily invented, but founded in the nature of human reason and hence unavoidable and never ceasing, contains the following four theses together with their antitheses. Just want to look at the first one now. The world has, as to time and space, a beginning, or a limit, you see. And the antithesis, that's the thesis, the antithesis. The world is, as to time and space, infinite. Now, I think it's time to take a break. Come back, we're going to look at this. I'm going to show you why this is at the basis of the distinction that he makes here. Because, but, let's see. Take a break. I can never find what I'm looking for when I bring it to class and try to, I can't, but it doesn't matter, that's it. But anyway, back to that little chart. The first antinomy there, time and space. The others are all interesting too, but we'll just take this one. Because, see, what does this mean? It means that if we try to think of space as infinite. It just goes on and on and on. Not just very large now, but that it literally goes on. And now something makes you say, no, it must stop somewhere. If you really try to think that thought, the idea that it just, right? That it just goes on and on without ever any limit or end. Something seems impossible. The mind bugs and says, no, it's got to stop somewhere. But then, of course, as soon as you stop it somewhere, then what's just over the wall, so that you go back again. So you flip-flop back and forth. If you try to think of space, and you flip-flop back and forth between, it goes on forever, it must stop somewhere. But it can't, it must go on. It's got to stop, right? That's the antinomy right there of space, you see, because your mind cannot rest with either one. Cannot rest with the idea that it just, you can rest in the sense you can stop thinking about it, but it can't rest with the idea that it never comes to an end, that it just, it's something that doesn't. But then, if you say, well, it's got to have an end, what do you mean? And how would it have an end? What would be just beyond it? See, as soon as you erect an ending, right? Same thing with time. You see, if you try to think of a beginning of time, think, there must be something that happened just before that. You see, go back. So you say, well, okay, then it must have a beginning. But your mind inevitably has time in it. It says, but what happened just before that? If you really try to think about it and try to see, what do I mean? Goes back. Must come to a beginning. Now, but then it must be something before that. See, so Kant says that simple fact shows us. What does it show us? Are we willing to take the consequences of what that shows us? What he says it shows us is that time and space cannot be real in themselves. We can't get a grasp of them because they don't form a clear idea. In other words, everything we experience is temporal. It's spread out in time and spread out in space. That's fine. But time and space, as if they're big things, okay? Containers in which everything else happens. Then we try to think about time and space in themselves. They dissolve for us. And so the more you think about it, he says, well, now, he's at great pains to show that everything else that we think about the world presupposes time and space. Takes place in time, it's temporal, it's spatial. One thing happens before another, one thing's farther than another. And yet time and space can't possibly be real in themselves. When we realize that, he says, then the whole thing falls apart. In other words, anything we think we understand about the world is within that framework, but that framework doesn't hold up as a reality. Therefore, X. Because everything we say is based on that. Even when we say, then certain things are beyond time and space. You go, wait a minute. We haven't even got time and space yet, and now we're going beyond them. See, it's all, as far as he's concerned, now the mind is working. Why? Because you see, time and space they're the frameworks in which we judge events to be causal and to be displacing each other and related to each other. You see, they're the frameworks in which we make those judgments. But when we start thinking them as if they're real, they work for us as the frameworks in which we make these judgments about experience, our experience. But when we think of them as if they're real, objectively, apart from our experience and thinking, they fall apart. So, therefore, everything within them falls apart, you see. So So we don't know anything about the world because we can't help but put it all in the utmost framework of time and space, and that unravels when we think about it. So time and space can't be real, therefore the whole idea of the world as we think of it as spread out in time and going back in space and so on just falls apart. I mean, there it is. Because they are the ultimate framework. The way he's got it set up, which makes sense. Space is the form of external perception, and time is the form of external and internal perception. It's one bit deeper. In other words, if we can think of things in space, everything external is in space, but if we think of our own ideas, for example, or something like that, we don't place them in space, but they're always in time. One happens after another. Augustine saw that, made time deeper than space because it covers both internal and external experience. So everything in the external world is mediated through both time and space. But, you see, and the internal world is mediated only through time. But both of those fall apart when we think of them in relation to infinity or not. So, it's as simple as that. Yeah, Brother Dave.
How does he know that there is a reality in itself?
That's another question. That's where we're going. That's what, yeah. Because he doesn't want to be an idealist. He says, I know, that's...
Because I would suppose you go outside of...
time and space and everything else.
Yeah.
See, let's get there, but let me get there a little bit more slowly because he says in here, the part I was just looking for, he says he understands, he's read all these guys, Berkeley and Locke and Berkeley, and he says, okay, with Locke and these people, you have primary and secondary qualities, and the secondary qualities are in us, but the primary qualities are in the things. He says, okay, then Berkeley comes along and rightly says, why can't the primary qualities be in things too? Because we only know them as combinations of the secondary qualities and right? So they're just as subjective, right? He may be slightly ignoring the problem that we explain the secondary qualities on the basis of the primary qualities and so on. But in any case, apart from that hierarchy among them, we've still gone down to say why can't the primary qualities be constituted also by our framework of thinking? And then once you say that, then he says, but this is where complete idealism goes. And of course he's always differentiating his position from idealism on the one hand, what he just simply calls idealism, and some kind of realism on the other. The realist says all these things are real, we see the world as it really is, it's really red and triangular, and it's really this and that, you see it, okay? And he says, no, with Berkeley and you and these people, we have to say at least that the secondary qualities are constituted by us, but once we start chipping away that way, we can say, there's no reason not to say the other too. And so we will, because we're going to go so far as to say what I just said, namely that space and time are unreal, and all the primary qualities are configurations of space and time. Motion, place, and extension, measure. See? So he says, we go all the way. Say these are all in us, but we're not idealists because, now I will put it in scholastic terms for a minute, not that he would, and with good reason, but I think this is what it comes down to, and this is where contradiction is. he's saying these are still qualities. They're qualities of the ding on zik, the thing in itself, you see, which we claim not to know anything about. Anything about. And of course, what you're asking is, well, if we know nothing about it, how can we even say it exists? I mean, what is it? If we could say something about being and say, well, see, because there's a sense in which this is true even in Aquinas, that even below the primary qualities there's the thing, and the thing is always invisible. It's you see, it's something that's not reducible to its qualities. But we know it because we know being through, you see, secondary qualities, primary qualities, and so on. We're immersed in being. We have that word being from the start, and we know we're talking about being, and we can begin to say things about being. We can say being is substance primarily and qualities secondary. But we can't picture the substance. See, in that sense, you can't really picture a chicken. And for Thomas either, not really. And it's a deep reality that expresses itself in these ways. But it's true that in Thomas and Aristotle and Thomas, the accent is way over on the realist side. So you say this is the way chickens are, and they have these qualities, they have the primary, and we come along and pick these up, and so on. But you could say, whichever way you say it, Kant would say, I'm not saying anything different in one sense, from the traditional realists. The things are invisible in themselves, we don't know, and these are all expressions. I'm just accenting the fact that these qualities are expressions to us, and those expressions are in part created by our own contribution, you see, our own framework that we bring. But so what? We're always going to say that to some extent, you see, and so now, so if you say, and Brother Andrew, this is sort of getting to something you asked me whether I thought he's on that. I think that having gone through this trip with Berkeley and Locke and the moderns about primary and secondary qualities and so on, we're more apt to say, gee, how much is constituted by us, or in our experience of things, and how much is the thing in itself, pointing to the mystery of the thing in itself. But if you say as Kant, now we'll take your question, Brother Nathan, in its form, and then we'll go to the other. If we say as Kant does, the thing in itself is one thing, and these are another, then we have nothing to say about the thing in itself. We can't say it's being, we can't use that word, we have no... And therefore it must dissolve ultimately. He doesn't want it to dissolve. In one sense, he wants to be saying something, in a way, no different, except with his own accent, from Aristotle or somebody, but just more sophisticated, saying we're aware of how much we contribute to this thing. But he is, because he's saying, as I understand it, the thing in itself is simply other. It has no connection, no analogy, you see, with what we are aware of. There's what we construct, and then there's this blank something we overlay it on. Once you say that, you never get the thing back together again, but then you have the very real question, how can you even say it has being, because you have no meaning to that word. It's gone.
And wouldn't it just be like an extension of your...
Yeah, so then we have to become absolute idealists, even though Kant doesn't want to. See, what's interesting about Kant is that he doesn't want to, but his way of keeping us from that is not particularly interesting because of what we just said. And that's why Hegel can come along and dissolve the whole thing and say, what X? Tell me something about it. You say, well, it exists. Oh, it exists. What can we say? We can say something about existence. Oh, and then we talk about being and the transcendentals of being, and unity, and are we talking about being? Then we have to find an analogy between everything we experience and the thing itself. See, so analogy of being holds that. Everything will be a unity, including the substance. It's especially the unity. It's the unifying thing of the manifold that we experience. Everything will be, expressively true, and it will be good because it will be a self-desirability that will, everything will have these aspects, like we were saying in metaphysics thing. And so, in the classical thing, you have an analogy between here that allows you to say being is mysterious, but it's expressing itself. Then you can say, how much of this expression is contributed by our antenna, and how much is that what we, and that's never ending, that dispute. That's what Kant is aware of, and he's correct. And the ancients weren't aware of. They didn't see how you could fluctuate from close to idealism to close to absolute realism. But absolute realism can't be it either. Absolute realism says there's mind and reality and being, and mind knows being just as it is. But what you're forgetting is that mind is part of being. So that, and I was hinting at this today, and then it was, so that if being is related to mind, to the intellect, is there a difference between them? Or is that being relating to itself in some way? Because mind is part of being. You see, how many ways can you have it? You try to make it a distinct object, which is kind of neutrally aware of being. When you think that through, it's full of problems. And I believe that, and that's. But if you go the opposite direction and think, we don't know anything about the thing in itself, it's just you can't even say a beast, then there's nothing but the subject. What you so what I think, Brother Andrew, that you were asking me, that Kant opens us up to, is in the modern period we have to be a little bit more flexible about how much we put in the subject and how much in the object. Stipulating, however, there's a flow between them. There's an expressive flow coming from the object, and the subject is also contributing to that, but is part of it too. And it gets, but it becomes less than this. Here's reality, and we know it as it is in itself. We conform to it. It's a little more flow between the two. And but I'll say more of that, because when we talk about Hegel, I'm going to tell you what's. But I think we have to be more more accepting of idealism to a certain degree. We have to say something's being communicated to us. Would the thing be green if we weren't here? Well, say yeah, it would be. There's no one there to see it. Well, but then it's not being picked up. So where's the green? Maybe it's just primary. But then the same with primary bodies. So maybe being's becoming fuller as you go up the hierarchy of being, and we're receiving it, and we are it, and we're reporting it back to itself in some fullness within common being, in which everything is in everything. I don't know, I haven't got this all worked out. I just think that the modern philosophers, and Kant among them, have opened us up to this flow between idealism and realism, but that a certain absolute realism is too simplistic, and a certain absolute idealism loses the whole thing too. And so there's some flow in here. And I think Kant helps us along the way to that. But the way he puts it, it falls right into absolute idealism, because you don't have any analogy or flow between you. You see, you need a continual flexibility and analogy between the subject and the object. And interrelationship in being. that is deep. Without all that, without that tissue of interrelationship within the ens commun, it just all falls apart and becomes now a complete subject or object. It's hard. But anyway, so I think there's something in that, and that's why the trip to Hegel, which is the next thing, is so interesting, because it's just clear that you don't, if the thing in itself, if you can't say anything about it, who can even say it? It's just it's a wheel that doesn't turn any wheels. It doesn't say anything. You don't need it. You just have subjectivity. So anyway, but what I want you to see is that this problem of time and space that Kant raised is an interesting one. It's not one that occurred to the ancients. and you see what he's saying? There's something limited in our entire spatio-temporal organization of reality that should make us question any absolutizing of it, as in modern materialism, for example. See, that's why my friend in graduate school would say, well, we just don't know reality itself. We work within this framework of time and space, and we can say this and that about it, within our current cosmological theories, but they're all still within this perspective that is ultimately contradictory in some way, and so, I don't know. But that's the only thing really that I can think gives us a greater sensitivity to that kind of problem. It never occurred to... but on the other hand, thinking of time and space so seriously as these things that we can place everything in and see what's going on in them, there's something very modern about that too. That's Galileo and Newton and so on, and taking space and time very seriously, like a graph paper on which everything happens. And it's all been opened up by the immensity of space and the going backwards in time as we try to talk about the universe. And it's all been opened up for us, but in a way that it was not there for the ancients at all. And it's stuff that's not easily resolved. See, when he actually got to talking about the arguments for the existence of God, he had other things to say. It's obvious from what we just said that if you try to talk about some reality in itself, beyond time and space, you see, you have no categories to do it in. Your language is all based in temporal and spatial things, and so because see, he won't allow a language of being, because that's just too muddy and too that's common to these guys. It's too unclear, and so it's obvious then that you can't argue for the existence of God. You can't say everything has a cause outside time and space. You see, because you don't know what you're talking about. You're just talking about nothing at this point, see? Suddenly you've taken something that applies within time and space. It's a synthetic a priori principle within time and space. Within time and space, that's the way it works. Everything we explore will always find causes as part of the structure. But we got to realize that this time and space is partly the way we've carved reality to fit our way of understanding it, and so we're stuck within that circle. But that means it's all right to say everything has a cause, every event has a cause, because that governs the whole of spatio-temporal reality that's given to our senses. But then to say, let's start using the notion of cause outside time and space, it makes no sense at all. Hume was right in that sense. Causation is temporal, and so on. So you can't use it outside time and space. It doesn't make any sense to say, oh, therefore there must be a cause of the world. Except you can only use that in the most there's a word, attenuated sense. And then you're not talking about a reality, it's just to kind of close the circle of the way we think. That's that thing I was talking about before, you have to say, but it doesn't mean anything except about the way we sort of think. But there's no content to that thought. So obviously you can't construct a causal argument for the existence of God. And he argues in here too against a design argument, because he says, look, and again takes Hume very seriously. Hume spends most of the time in that book arguing with Cleanthes, right? Because Cleanthes is upholding a design argument, very simple, doesn't want to get metaphysical, see, like the Mia does. It just says, well, look, if you find a watch in the field, it's made by somebody, some intelligence, and so look at the complex nature of the world. It must be made by a higher intelligence. Kant says the best you can say comes to almost nothing. It's like, as the watch is to a maker, so the world is to the unknown. It somehow comes from it or something, from the unknown. And you can't say, to a higher intelligence or something, because that hits all of Hume's objections, Philo's objections about, what makes you think it's got to be a mind that brings order into things, and the way the analogy keeps falling down on the Philo's attack. So all you can say is, sure, as the world seems to have some. It's over against the backdrop. It's finite in some way. Whatever you mean by the world, knowing that time and space you can't contain it in that. But anyway, it all seems to be. If you want to say it has some sort of author or ultimate unknown, sure. It doesn't tell you anything. See, so he says, look, those design arguments, teleological arguments, as he calls them, right? Teleological, having to do with order and purpose and so on. They push us back to a cosmological argument like the ancients tried. Everything has a cause. But that doesn't work for the reasons we just said. And it doesn't work for another reason too. Because if you say there must be the causes must come to a stop somewhere, or else nothing would happen, then there must be something that causes itself in some way, or doesn't need a cause, an uncaused cause. And that would have to be a being who somehow exists of its own nature. It doesn't need to be caused. So if a being that exists by its own nature is possible, we grant that, then we go with the ontological argument. Because the ontological argument says, I have the idea of a being whose essence is to exist. Therefore it exists. Because, like Descartes says, right? I can't deny its existence. I have to attribute existence to it because that belongs to it by essence. So once I have that idea, I have to say it exists. What Kant is saying is, no, you don't have that idea. just like Aquinas, except that Kant is saying it worse. Kant is saying, you see, Aquinas is saying, I don't know whether something can have existence as part of its essence. I'm willing to, but I can't see that connection. Therefore, I can't start with that idea. Kant is saying, I can see that existence and essence are just two different things. If you want to talk about it, he doesn't like talking about it much, but what you want, if you mean what something is and that something is, by definition, they're just two different things, and never the two shall meet. And so, the whole idea of a being whose essence involves existence necessarily is a contradiction. Once you see that, you can't use the causal argument either, because the causal argument depends on the idea of a being whose essence, it resolves itself in a necessary being, a being whose essence is to exist. And since such a thing is impossible, we have to throw the whole thing out. So all the arguments go out the window. Now you see, the difference is that Aquinas says, I can't tell I don't have the idea, so I don't know if there can be a being whose essence involves existence. There could be, or there might not be. I find out that there is by seeing that there must be an ultimate cause. See? So the idea forces itself on me, and I don't have an idea of it. Even then, that's why I do not have an idea of the essence of God. Forces itself on me because I see there must be a first cause. So my argument for the first cause does not depend on the idea. My argument for the first cause is the buck's got to stop somewhere, and that would be a being whose essence somehow, in a way that I can't see, includes existence. So there must be one. It's very subtle and easy to confuse, and big arguments can go around it. But that's the difference. And so for Kant, none of you could see right a priori at the beginning, if you like, that there can't be, you can't use this notion of cause outside the realm of experience. It's made to deal with things in time and in experience. Outside it's just words. And and secondly, that the arguments then pile up this way. And the idea of a being whose essence is existence makes no sense, and so you can't use it at the end of an argument either. See, Thomas would say, in a way it doesn't make sense to me, but I see that it has to be, but I don't claim to have a clear idea of it, but I don't see that it's a contradiction. See, I can see that square circle is a contradiction. If I could see that a being whose essence is existence is a contradiction, then I would have to not accept it. But I can't see it. I can't see it either way. But see, that's why Aquinas can say, I don't have an idea of God. I don't have the idea of a being whose essence is existence. But I know that's what God is. It becomes a definite description in place of an essence, like the present King of France. I don't know who it is or anything about him, but I know there must be one. So I know there must be a first cause. And I can see that first cause would have to have essence as an existence as one, but I don't see how that is possible, but I certainly don't claim it's impossible. So, therefore it must be. That's why for Thomas Schatzer constantly go from the created to the uncreated. You can't start with the idea because we don't have the idea, as we said last time. So these things all wrap up together. See, Kant becomes the denial that essence and existence could be one. Thomas doesn't say that. And in fact, we know it must be true somewhere because we know that there must be an ultimate cause and nothing would be. And so, how subtle that is. That you have to have these levels. You have to be able to say, oh, God is a being whose essence is existence, without saying I have an idea of that. Aquinas can say that easily. What I'm saying is that those words must apply. I see that they are the words. But how they apply, I can't picture. I can't. So we preserve the mystery of God on the one hand, and the thread of ascent to the mystery on the other. What can I say? So it seems to me that that Kant is just, again, this issue of clear and distinct ideas is at the basis of this whole thing. If you can't have good fuzzy ideas, then you can't talk about anything ultimately, the one, the good, the true, any of those important notions. Not really. You can in a way. So that's the problem here. Seems to me. They fell silent. What do you think, Brother Andrew?
It's a lot.
Yeah, I guess I'm saying that what we learn from Kant is to be a little bit more flexible about how much we bring to it and how much is in the object, and a little more charitable to Berkeley, who's really saying God's directly addressing us through the world. That's what it is. It's a divine address. It's, but who's us and who's God, and how do we distinguish all that within being? You see, you got to have a framework, but to be more flexible with some of that, see the problems. And there may be a way in which Kant helps us to see, and I think it does, certain limitations of the scientific methodology. See, we're distinguishing it from something more metaphysical. But he's championing it. And so for him, in the external world, there can be no freedom. We know freedom from the inside. The same world in which we know the categorical imperative. But the two worlds don't come together, you see. When we look at the world, it's a world of necessity. Everything is causal, and causal necessity governs everything. And there can't be any wiggle room. You see, there's just... What do you think about this time, the time and space thing? I mean, what about... Is that the last word on that? Just think about time. Like, for example, I don't have as much trouble thinking about time going forward infinitely as I do about time going backward. Do you? See, if I say time goes back and back and back, I keep thinking it must have a beginning, right? Do you? Mm-hmm. See. But if I think of time as going forward infinitely, I don't have a problem with it. I suppose because then it's like the series of integers, you just always add one. And you can always add, so why not? Whereas going back, you're not always you're adding in your counting, but you keep discovering more. It's different. Time going back. I don't know if you feel it that way, than going forward.
Is this what Spitzer was addressing?
Yeah, partly. And with space, I don't know, space seems more problematic to me. And it's not surprising that in the modern theory of the universe, you keep hearing that the universe is unbounded but finite, they keep saying these things that, right? And it's caught right within the same kind of stuff. in some way, and then you have to add dimensions into it, and that's all that. But the idea of an infinite three-dimensional space seems problematic. I think Kant is right. Something. What were we going to say?
I just had a question, because if you say space is infinite, and so you'd say it's like ultimately infinite in whatever way, degree, and God is ultimately infinite, can there be two like infinites?
Yes, because Spinoza already wrestled with this. What Spinoza, you hear what his question is? If you have an infinite space, does that rival the infinity of God? Because infinite in space, what we mean when we say that God is infinite is absolutely unlimited. In power, in anything, right? Take power of one, he can do anything. It's not a size question. Whereas the space question is a size question, and you might say infinity in that area doesn't rival God at all, because God's infinity is beyond space and beyond size and all that. It's another order, I guess. I know. You see what Spinoza actually said, and I think you're right. The question doesn't quite go away when you say that, because what Spinoza wound up saying was the infinity of space is not the same as God's infinity, but it is infinite, and therefore it means the space is God's body. Insofar as God, you see, in other words, God is more than bodily.
Yeah.
But see, that's why he said space and time are two of the infinite attributes of God, because, see, it's interesting to talk about this. You see all the interrelations between these thinkers and the problems they're dealing with, right? But he said that space, infinite space, is an expression, a slice, if you will, you see, of God. Infinity in one mode, you see, whereas God's infinity extends way beyond that, but it includes that. So yes, and he was on to something. If you're going to say space is infinite, don't you have to say that it's well, because here, look, if you say with Aristotle, let's just take space for a minute. For Aristotle and for Einstein, insofar as I understand this, space is and there's a difference, but they have this in common. Space is not Euclidean. Space opens up as a field between things. And if it's always related to points of radiation of field, so that wherever you go, there's going to be spatial extension, but it's curved because it curves around with the things, and so it's not this one unilateral thing, Euclidean geometry that just goes on like the line. See, the lines curve, and they curve around, and light itself bends, and that was interesting. It curves around in relation to the things. Space is ultimately related to the interrelations of the things. So is time, but stay away from time for a minute. Just that, and that's true in Aristotle, and it's true in Thomas. What that means is, if you didn't have any things, you wouldn't have any space. Right? Now, that notion is important because if you have God creating things,
that he creates space.
then space is created with them
And when
as the matrix of their interrelationship.
And when
But
it's-
only in and around and through them. You can't. Space doesn't just go up by itself somewhere. It's the relational play between them. So it may be curved in a way that you could keep moving around it and maybe never come back to the same point. But it's and that's why they say it's bounded all the same. See, because it doesn't have edges. You can't go to the edge of it because you're always within some field in relation to some objects, and it's moving around and it's curving around. So you don't get to any external boundary anywhere, and yet it's not this plane that just goes out and out and out and out and out. See? But if you have Newton's space, see, this gives us a problem. It's Newton's space. Newton's space is a container that would be there even if there were no things. So already in Newton's concept, you have space as a kind of rival to God because he can't create it. How does he create it? What is it? It's not anything. It's pure emptiness, and yet it's like Parmenides non-being in a way. You see that, right? It's like pure emptiness. But it's not created, because how would you create space? You see? So therefore, space from a Newtonian perspective on space has an absoluteness to it that does rival God. You have to then tangle God up with it somehow, say it was always there, it's part of God in some way. Newton didn't get that far himself, but Spinoza was just taking Newton's space, and he said it's God's sensorium, like our senses. You know, it's his body, it's his way of and it's infinite. So you're right in a way. If you take Newtonian space, it's a problem because it's infinite and there, even if there weren't any things. But if God, and if you say, well, God created it, yeah, but what are we saying when you say God created it? Say God creates things. Yes, you can imagine any one of them not being. So I think you're right. There's a problem there, and it comes from Newton's space, which Kant is dealing with also. So we might want to say, look, if you get away from Newton's space and go back to the notion of space, or in a new form now, in an Einsteinian kind of way, you would have a space that might be in one sense infinite, but in another sense unbounded, because you don't come to the edge of it. There's no edge of it, but it does, but you stay within it as you move around, whatever, because of the things. So there is a way in which maybe Newton's space and time are what's gotten in the way here. And even though I'm contrasting this so nicely with what Aristotle and St. Thomas would say, it's that they didn't quite get this far to thinking this through. I mean, nobody immediately objected to Newton's space at the time when he said it, as if you can't say that because we have a different idea of space. Wasn't that formed, you see? And for Newton, it worked to have space as a graph on which you could plot everything. Here's the graph, and time too, but the graph, and nothing could be going on in it, and there could be nothing there. But now here's something, and here's something, and here's something, and it's this distance from this and that. You see, so the neutral graph on which you can plot everything is a background for doing Newtonian physics. Einstein changes that, so let's see a picture of that. But so that's a problem that may, Kant just may be wrong, that thinking about space as infinite, you're thinking about space the wrong way. You're thinking about it as, it's not that it's either subjective or objective. No, there may be an objective space that's relational, and therefore doesn't just go on and on and on like a Euclidean framework, and doesn't offer this problem. So maybe this a metaphysical way outside that cage. And similarly with time, we may have to think of time as having a beginning because causality and time are into, but forget time for now. Just take space for now. But I think I'm glad you raised that, Jeff, because that's important, that difference. You see, a lot of things have entered, so a lot of people say Kant's framework has to be bypassed and it changes things because Euclidean geometry, as you probably know, for Einsteinian space, it turns out that Riemannian geometry, in other words, geometries that, what was it, Lobachevsky or somebody in the 19th century, they developed some geometries that were absolutely consistent but denied the parallel postulate. The parallel postulate is what? If you have, if two lines are parallel to each other, I'm going to draw these two, it means they have the same slope with a third line. Okay? Now, does it mean that they never meet? You say, well, of course, if this is a straight line, how could they ever meet? But then the question is, what do you mean by a straight line? Because you're going to go around in circles literally here. The definition of a straight line, shortest distance between 2 points. But what is that? Because, you see, you get into this question of the curvature of space. And so it turns out, but just apart from that little paradox, that if you deny that they never meet, you can deny that by saying they converge at infinity, or you can deny it by saying they diverge at infinity. Okay, that the parallel lines are always, but asymptotically converging, and so you don't see that close up, but they are. And so either of those geometries, it turns out, is internally logically consistent, just as Euclid's is. It doesn't contradict any further principles in geometry or anything. And you say, gee, I thought it was obvious that parallel lines, but parallel lines are not defined as lines that never meet. They're defined, you see, as lines that form the same slope with a third line. And so the issue becomes, what is a straight line, and so on. And that turns out to be muddy. And so it turns out that some of these geometries that deny the parallel axiom are useful in modern relativity physics. And so there goes Euclidean space. You see, the idea that because the Euclidean mindset was that the lines that form the slope with the same slope with a straight line will never meet at infinity. So it begins to look a little different, the notion of space, that it's not Euclidean. So many people will say, well, Kant's working still with Euclidean space, Newtonian space, so was Spinoza. And so some of the subjectivist consequences of that we can get rid of. So we don't have we can say, no, we can in a way conceive, sort of. It's more like metaphysics now. We hardly know what we're saying, but we can conceive space as not Euclidean and not infinite in that sense of nauseatingly endless, Euclidean lines. So there's something to that. It's a good point. All that came out of thinking about the rivalry of infinite space and God, but it just occurred to me, that's what Spinoza was struggling with. You see, they were all trying to be consistent with science in various ways. They wanted to say that science is, that physical science as we now understand it is tremendous, finding laws that are related as time t1 and time t2 is what they predict, and these things, this is wonderful. And we're getting a handle on nature that we did not have before. And they want to get to the presuppositions of that. And if you get Newtonian time and space, you do have a problem here. Newton's not going to think about this. He doesn't care. He just goes ahead like my friend in graduate school and does it. I mean, he thinks a little bit metaphysically, but it's not his, it's not his focus. He wants to, he develops the theorems that work and that pull things together. But the philosopher's going to say, wait a minute, is that what space is like? Then it can't be real, or see this. So maybe that in itself, those thoughts about space and time, loosen up this line a bit and make it more transparent. Well, the second time Kant didn't take his walk was the time he died. That's true. But that was a long time. But anyway, so trying to make sense out of science becomes one of the major postulates of modern philosophy. Okay, there's a good example of it right there. Glad you reminded me of that. Newtonian space and time as absolutes and have to be taken metaphysically seriously. And then what's the epistemological conclusion to that? Well, then maybe they're impossible, really, so they're only about us. You see. But maybe not. So, yeah. Kant, as I said, Kant himself was a scientist in his own right. He made contributions to I forget what, but he did. He knew a lot of stuff. He knew a lot of mathematics. He was very conversant. They were all conversant. The rationalists, incidentally, were conversant. Spinoza, and these people were very conversant with the science of the time. And you can look at Spinoza's whole system as an attempt to do a metaphysics that corresponds to Newtonian space and time. It's sort of pantheistic. The space is God's body. And sure. And then the empiricist is saying, I don't want to get into any of that stuff. Let's just do the science. And all we need for that is, what Hume says we need. That's enough of that. We don't need to get metaphysical at all. It doesn't get us anywhere. All right, that's enough of that. Let's quit. This is such hard stuff. And I'm just so glad. I just had forgotten about, for some reason, as I was, is that question of Newtonian space. All right. Now, when you get to somebody like Hegel, you get this. He fits more in the 19th century Romantic movement. That is, you get people who say science schminance. Because they look at it as just one thing that we do, and it's not the dominant thing. And Hegel's absolutely brilliant, but he does this whole thing from the standpoint of an absolute idealism, in which all that's happening is that absolute thought is unfolding itself, going out from itself and returning to itself, like the Trinity. And we're all involved in this, and it's one big system. And but it's a different flavor. These guys in the 18th century are all still very much dominated by physical science, and they're contributing to it themselves, or they're thinking about it. The examples they use are all from that's very 18th century. And in the 19th century, you get a romantic reaction that goes into idealism and is much more interested in literature and history and all these things as contributing to a larger type of understanding. And Hegel is the great master of that. He pulls everything into his system, the whole of human history and the arts, politics, all that's going on is part of God's understanding of himself. That was Anyway, we'll quit for tonight, but we'll take a little bit of that next time. Maybe.